The digital clock on the coffee maker reads 6:42 a.m. when the first truck arrived. I was on my porch, as I was most mornings, a warm ceramic mug cradled in my hands, watching the mist burn off the valley. The air was cool, and smelled of damp earth and pine, the way it always had. The truck, a gleaming white Ford F-250 with a prominent Bishop Construction logo on the door, was not part of that familiar picture. It idled for a moment at the edge of the asphalt that marked the end of the primly manicured evergreen estates and the beginning of my property. A line as clear in my mind as a scar. Then, with a lurch of diesel-powered arrogance, it rolled onto the grass, its tires leaving dark, wet tracks on the gentle slope of my hillside. I didn't move. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitterness of familiar anger. The truck was followed by another, this one a flatbed carrying a small bobcat excavator. And then a small convoy of dusty sedans and pickups. Doors slammed, voices echoed in the quiet morning air. A profane and unwelcome intrusion. A woman emerged from the passenger side of the lead truck, Karenina Bishop. She wore crisp, new blue jeans, expensive-looking work boots that had never seen a day of actual work, and a hard hat that sat on her perfectly coiffed hair like a crown. She held a rolled-up set of blueprints in one hand and gestured expansively with the other. Pointing up my hill, her voice carrying across the dew-laden field, she was pointing at my land. Not the ambiguous borderland, not the nebulous zone of neighborly dispute, but deep into the heart of the 30 acres. My wife, Eleanor, and I had bought 40 years ago. The land where we had planned to build a small cabin for our grandchildren. The land where Eleanor's ashes were scattered beneath the tallest oak. Karenina Bishop was pointing at Eleanor's oak, and she was smiling. I remained on the porch, a statue in a worn flannel robe. I watched as her crew unloaded the bobcat. I watched as a man in a fluorescent vest began hammering wooden stakes into the ground, a good 200 yards inside my property line. Each thud of his hammer was a physical blow, a precise and calculated violation. They were laying out the foundations for something, and it did not take a surveyor, which I had been for 45 years, to understand the sheer scale of their trespass. Finally, after perhaps 20 minutes of this methodical desecration, Karenina seemed to remember my existence. She turned, spotted me on the porch, and began walking toward my house. She strode with the unearned confidence of a feudal lord inspecting a peasantess hovel. Her smile was gone, replaced by a mask of performative determination. She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, deliberately placing herself below me, a subtle power play I recognized from 100 zoning board meetings. She expected me to be intimidated, to be cowed by her authority. And, the noisy machinery at her back, Arthur, she began, her voice loud, intended for her crew as much as for me. I see you're up. Good. I wanted to let you know that work is commencing on the new Hillside villas. It's going to be a tremendous asset to the community. I said nothing. I just looked at her, then glanced at the men digging into the earth that held my wife's memory. The coffee in my mug was getting cold. Her forced pleasantness evaporated. This is a formal notification, she snapped, her tone shifting to that of HOA president, a title she wore like a military sash. The Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association has officially reclaimed this parcel for development as per the Community Master Plan. Your tacit permission for public access over the years has been interpreted as a dedication of the land. We have a legal opinion to that effect. Any attempt to interfere with the construction will be met with legal action. We will have you cited for trespassing on our work site. Trespassing? On my own land? The absurdity of it was so profound, it was almost elegant. She was standing on my lawn, telling me I would be cited for trespassing on my own hill. where her men were carving up the very soul of my life. She pointed a finger at me. The nail a perfect, blood-red oval. I am the president of this association, and this is association property now. We have the permits, we have the financing, and we have the will to see this through. Do not make this difficult, Arthur. I finally lowered the mug from my lips. I looked at her, at the hard hat, at the men defiling my hill, at the ugly, deep tracks in the grass. I thought about the file in my office, the one labeled Evergreen Estates, nearly 4 inches thick, filled with years of her petty tyrannies, her misread bylaws, her threats against my neighbors. I thought about the original plat map from 1887. I kept in my fireproof safe, the one that showed my property lines established by stone markers and chains, a document that had survived fires and floods and the casual arrogance of people like her. I thought about the quiet title action my lawyer had filed 6 months ago, the one she had been served for and had summarily ignored. I looked at this woman, radiating a confidence born of pure, unadulterated ignorance. She had no idea. She had no idea of the legal and financial doom she was gleefully inviting upon herself and her entire association. She had just stood on my property, on camera, and confessed to a conspiracy to commit criminal trespass and conversion of real property. She had no idea that this was not the beginning of her victory, but the beginning of her end. And I had the receipts. Every single one. Okay, I said. It was the only word I spoke. I turned, walked back into my house, and closed the door, leaving her standing there in stunned, sputtering silence. She had just handed me the final, perfect, irrefutable piece of evidence I needed. She had no idea she had just built her own gallows and handed me the rope. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain. A story like this doesn't begin on a Tuesday morning with a construction crew. It begins years, even decades, earlier. It begins with love, with loss, and with the slow, creeping encroachment of a world that values newness over history and noise over peace. My name is Arthur Vance. For 45 years, I was a licensed land surveyor. It's not a glamorous profession. People think of it as a man with a tripod and a funny-looking camera on the side of the road. But it is more than that. It is the practice of applied history. We are the keepers of boundaries, the interpreters of ancient deeds, written in elegant, looping script. We find the iron pins buried by our predecessors a century ago. We read the landscape for the ghosts of old fences. We translate the legal language of meets and bounds. Thence north 14 degrees, 32 minutes west, 212 feet to a stone pile, unto a line on the ground that a person can see and understand. It is a job that requires patience, precision, and a deep, abiding respect for the facts as they are written, not as one wishes them to be. My wife, Eleanor, used to say I didn't just survey land. I communed with it. She said I could read a deed like a poet reads a sonnet, finding the hidden meaning in every clause. We bought our 30 acres when we were young and foolish and deeply in love. It was all we could afford. A rough, untamed hillside northwest of the city, considered too steep and remote for serious development. To us, it was paradise. We cleared a small plot ourselves, just enough for a modest house, a garden, and a porch that faced the sunrise. We built the house with our own hands, with help from friends and family on the weekends. Every nail, every board was a testament to our life together. The rest of the land, the steep wooded hillside, we left wild. It was our buffer, our sanctuary. We walked it every day. We knew every tree, every game trail, every patch of wildflowers. When Eleanor got sick, it was those woods that gave her comfort. And when she passed, it was in the shade of the largest oak, on the highest point of the hill, that I scattered her ashes, just as Shade asked. The land was not just property to me, It was a living memorial. It was the last tangible piece of her I had left. The world changed around us, as it always does. The city grew, and the suburbs sprawled. About 15 years ago, a developer bought the farmland adjacent to my property. They put in roads, sewers, and a grand stone entrance gate. They called it a Evergreen Estates, a name as blandly aspirational as the houses they built. They were large, ostentatious things, all vinyl siding and complex roof lines, built close together on tiny lots. From my porch, I watched the community fill up with people who drove expensive cars and seemed to be in a constant, hurried state of agitation. At first, they were fine neighbors. We waved. I didn't mind the occasional kid cutting across the corner of my property to get to the school bus stop. I didn't mind when families would walk up the hill for a picnic. I was a good neighbor. Eleanor had always believed in being a good neighbor. But then, about 7 years ago, Karenina Bishop was elected president of the Homeowners Association. I had met her a few times. Her husband, a perpetually weary-looking man who ran a moderately successful construction business, had bought one of the largest houses. Karenina herself didn't work in any traditional sense. Her job, as she saw it, was the perfection and administration of Evergreen Estates. She was a woman who seemed to vibrate with a need for control. She had an opinion on everything, the precise shade of beige that was acceptable for exterior trim, the maximum allowable height of lawn grass, 3 inches measured, the approved list of seasonal decorations. Her rise to power was a study in petty tyranny. She and a small group of acolytes would walk the neighborhood with clipboards noting infractions. A Childa's bicycle left on a lawn overnight. A $50 fine. A garbage can put out 2 hours too early. A $75 fine. Mr. Henderson, a retired widower in his 80s, was fined $200 because the small flag he put on his mailbox for the postman was not an approved attachment. She terrorized people. But she did it with a smile, always framing it as being for the good of the community, and protecting our property values. Busy with their own lives, just paid the fines to make her go away. They were afraid of her. They didn't want the hassle. I stayed out of it. My property was not part of the HOA. I was not subject to her rules. I was just an observer. But a surveyor is, by nature, an observer who documents. I started a file. I didn't know why at first. It just felt like the right thing to do. Every time I saw one of her little violation notices stuck to a neighbor's door, I'd take a picture with my phone. When Mr. Ball Henderson told me, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and shame, about his fight over the mailbox flag, I had him forward me the email chain. I printed it out and put it in the file. When another neighbor, a young family with 2 small children, was told they had to tear down their unapproved swing set, I saved the community newsletter where Karenina boasted about her rigorous enforcement of the covenants. The file grew. It was a meticulously organized catalog of her reign, cross-referenced and tabbed. It had copies of the HOA's own covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs, which I had obtained from the county recorder's office. I had read them, cover to cover. And I noted, with the professional interest of a surveyor, how often her enforcement actions were based on a complete misreading or a deliberate twisting of the actual text. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was inventing them to suit her whims. But no one challenged her. On paper, she was the law. The issue with my land began subtly. It started with language. In the HOA newsletter, he began referring to my hillside as a community green belt. Then it was the North Slope Reserve. She was creating a narrative, rebranding my private property as a public amenity. She started organizing a community cleanup days on my land. Without asking, I would find orange trash bags filled with beer cans and fast food wrappers left near my property line. A passive-aggressive gift. Then came the first direct approach. 3 years ago, she appeared on my porch with a platter of cookies and a proposal. The HOA, she said, wanted to formalia the publica's use of the hillside. They would maintain the trails, put in benches, maybe even a small gazebo. All they needed was for me to sign a small document, a recreational easement. I politely declined. I explained that the land was private, that it had deep personal significance, and that I was not interested in a public easement. I did not mention my wife. I did not show her the emotion she could later use as a weapon. I was calm, polite, and firm. I kept the receipts of our conversation in my head. Her smile tightened. The cookies, I noted, were from a local bakery, not homemade. This was a business transaction. Arthur, she said, her voice dripping with condescension, that land is just sitting there. It's a fire hazard. The community could put it to such good use. It's selfish to keep it all to yourself. Selfish. That was the word she used. I thanked her for the cookies, which I later threw away, and told her my decision was final. She left in a huff, and I knew it was not over. I went to my office and made a new entry in the Evergreen Estates file. I detailed the date, the time, and the substance of our conversation. I noted her use of the word elfish. It was a key, I thought, to her worldview. Anything that was not hers, but that she wanted, was being unfairly withheld. The final piece of the foundation was laid a year ago. I received a certified letter from an unknown law firm. It was a notice of a proposed zoning variance for a parcel of land adjacent to mine. It was vague, full of legalese, but my professional instincts tingled. I pulled the parcel number and looked it up in the county GIS database. The parcel was listed as A unassigned, common area, Evergreen Estates. I went to my old maps, the ones I kept from the original development. I cross-referenced the developer's plans with the county records, and I found it. A surveyor's error from 15 years ago. A scrivener's error, really. When the developer had recorded the final plat for Evergreen Estates, they had created a phantom parcel. A small, triangular piece of land on the map that did not exist in reality. It was a paper fiction. But the HOA, under Karanaya's direction, had apparently seized upon this error. They had paid taxes on this non-existent parcel for years. They were now trying to use this fictional piece of land as a legal foothold, a beachhead from which they could launch an invasion of my actual, physical property. It was at that moment I called my lawyer, a sharp young man named Ben Carter, who had once been a student in a guest lecture I gave at the university. Ben, I said, I think I have a problem, but I also think I have a solution. I want to file a quiet title action. A quiet title action is the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon in property law. It is a lawsuit you file against the entire world, known and unknown, asserting that your title to a piece of land is absolute and superior to all other claims. It is slow, expensive, and requires meticulous documentation. It requires you to notify any and all potential claimants, which we did. We served Karenina Bishop as president of the Evergreen Estates HOA with the legal notice. Her response was telling. She did nothing. She likely saw the dense legal document, saw my name, and assumed it was some cranky old man's desperate gambit. She probably threw it in the trash. She had no idea that her failure to respond to contest the action was a default. It was a silent confession that she had no legal claim. She had no idea that for the past 6 months, while she was busy planning her grand construction project, my lawyer and I were quietly moving through the courts, checking every box, filing every motion, building an unassailable legal wall around my land. So when I closed the door on her that Tuesday morning, leaving her sputtering on my lawn, It was not an act of fear or retreat. It was an act of finality. She had completed my case for me. She had delivered her own testimony, on camera, and confirmed her intent. The trap had been set for months. She had just willingly, eagerly, and with great fanfare, walked right into it. I went back to my desk and got to work. The first thing I did was not to call the police or my lawyer. The first thing I did was pour a fresh cup of coffee, sit down at my desk and pull out the Hillside file. It was no longer just a file. It had grown into a banker's box. My home office, which had been a place of quiet retirement, was now a command center. On one wall I had pinned a large high-resolution aerial photograph of my property and the adjacent evergreen estates. I had marked my true property line in red grease pencil. I had marked the location of every stake her crew had hammered into my ground in blue. The area of encroachment was a stark, undeniable stain. I took the memory card from the security camera that was discreetly mounted in the eaves of my porch. It was a high-definition, wide-angle lens. I downloaded the Morningas events onto my computer. The video was crystal clear. The audio was perfect. Karenia's every word, her threats, her claims of ownership, her identification of herself as the HOA president acting in her official capacity, it was all there. I saved the file in 3 separate places: my local hard drive, a cloud server, and a physical thumb drive that I labeled Bishop Confession and placed in my fireproof safe. This was not a he said, she said situation anymore. This was a documentary. My next step was to begin the formal, written warnings. People like Karenina thrive on ambiguity, on verbal agreements, on understandings. I intended to eliminate all ambiguity. I drafted a formal cease and desist letter. It was not emotional. It was cold, procedural, and factual. It cited the exact parcel number of my land. It referenced the book and page number of my deed, recorded in the county courthouse in 1978. It detailed the specific nature of the trespass, including the presence of heavy machinery and construction personnel. It demanded the immediate cessation of all work, the removal of all equipment and personnel, and the restoration of the property to its original condition. It gave them a deadline of 24 hours to comply, after which I would pursue all available legal and civil remedies. I didn't send it. From my personal email. I drove to a copy shop and had it sent via a service that provides a time-stamped, legally verifiable email with delivery and read receipt confirmation. I sent it to every email address I could find for the HOA board, including Karenina's official presidential address and her personal one, which Mr. Henderson had helpfully provided. The cost was $17. I kept the receipt. Then, I sent a physical copy via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the official address of the Evergreen Estates HOA and to Karenina Bishop's home address. This required a signature upon delivery, creating an undeniable paper trail that the notice was received. The cost was $28.50. I kept the receipt. Finally, I printed out a dozen copies of the letter, laminated them at the copy shop, and drove to the boundary of my property. I did not confront the work crew. I simply walked along my property line, the one I knew to the inch, and posted the notices on trees and fence posts, facing outward, where they would be impossible to miss. Facin'. They were a line of silent, plastic-coated sentinels, each one a testament to the facts she chose to ignore. Her response was predictable. And it was exactly what I had hoped for. About 2 hours after I received the electronic notification that my email had been opened, Karenina's white truck came roaring back up the access road. I watched from my office window, using a pair of binoculars. She got out, marched over to the nearest laminated notice I had posted, ripped it from the tree, crumpled it in her fist, and threw it on the ground. She then went down the line and tore down every single one. Her actions, performed in broad daylight, were another gift. She was not just ignoring a legal warning, she was actively destroying it. It demonstrated her contempt for the process, for the law itself. I recorded this as well with a long-lens camera from my upstairs window. Another file saved, another nail in the coffin. That evening, I got a call from Ben, my lawyer. "Arthur, I got a copy of the letter you sent. It is perfect. Concise, factual, non-emotional. Watch us the play here." "The play, Ben," I said, "is that we let her build it." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Build it, Arthur. They're building condos on your land. We can get an injunction tomorrow morning. We can have a sheriff's deputy out there shutting them down by noon." "I know," I said calmly. "And if we do that, this becomes a simple dispute, a boundary argument. We go to court, we show our survey, they show their faulty one, and a judge tells them to move their stakes a few hundred feet. We win, but we win small. They'll have to pay for the survey and maybe some damages. Karenina will spin it as a misunderstanding. She'll survive. The community will see me as the difficult old man who held up progress over a few feet of dirt." Ben was quiet, processing this. "So, you want to let them build it?" "The whole thing? We're talking millions of dollars in construction, Arthur." "Let them clear the land," I said, looking out at the darkening hillside where the ugly scars of the dais work were still visible. "Let them pour the foundations, let them frame the walls and run the electrical. Let them put in the landscaping and the high-end finishes. Let them get the certificate of occupancy. Let them pre-sell every single unit to an unsuspecting buyer. Let them take out massive loans in the HOA's name. Let her convince everyone that she is a visionary, a genius of real estate. Let her build her entire monument to her own ego." "And then?" Ben asked, his voice a mixture of awe and professional concern. "And then," I said, "when every dollar has been spent, when every contract has been signed, when every buyer has unpacked their boxes, we present them with the final recorded judgment from our quiet title action. We show them the deed, and we explain, very simply, that they are all tenants in buildings they don't own on land that isn't theirs. It's my land. It's all my land." Ben let out a low whistle. "Arthur, that's a diabolical, and I think I love it. But the risk is enormous. What if we missed something? What if they find some old easement, some forgotten right-of-way?" This was the moment for my own professional work to begin. "That's my job, Ben," I told him. "I'm going to spend the next few months doing the most thorough title search and boundary reconstruction in the history of this county. I'm going to go back to the original Spanish land grant if I have to. I'm going to find every deed in the chain of title, every survey, every easement, every right-of-way. I'm going to build a case file so thick and so ironclad that by the time we're done, there will not be a single molecule of doubt in anyone's mind about who owns that hill." And that is when I uncovered the bombshell. It took me about 3 weeks of solid work, locked in my office, surrounded by dusty plat books from the county archive and digital records from the recorder's office. I had brought in a trusted former colleague, a young woman named Maria, who was a genius with digital mapping and historical records. She was my corroborating professional. We were tracing the chain of title for the developer who had created Evergreen Estates, looking for anything that might give them a sliver of a claim. We found it, not in my records, but in theirs. Buried deep in the digital archives of the County Planning Commission was the full application packet for the Evergreen Estates development, filed in 1998. It was over 1,000 pages long. Most of it was boilerplate, environmental impact reports, soil studies, traffic analyses. But Maria, with her eagle eye, found an appendix, Appendix G. covenant agreements with adjacent landowners. There was only one document in Appendix G. It was a formal, notarized agreement between the developer and me. I vaguely remembered signing it 20 years ago. The developer, a decent man named George, had been worried that my large, undeveloped parcel might someday become something undesirable. Gravel pit, or a cell phone tower that would hurt his property values. He had offered me a small sum of money in exchange for me signing a restrictive covenant. The covenant was simple. It stated that I would not use my land for any industrial or heavy commercial purpose. In exchange, he and his successors and assigns, which included the Evergreen Estates, HOA formally and irrevocably acknowledged that my 30 acres were entirely private property, that no claim of easement or access existed, and that they waived any future right to challenge my property lines. It was all there. In their own founding document. A legal instrument recorded with the county that Karenina Bishop, as president of the HOA, was bound by. She either had never read it. It didn't matter. It was the ultimate weapon. It was a self-inflicted wound that had been sitting in a public file for 2 decades, just waiting. I printed out a dozen copies. I had Maria certify that she had located it in the public record. I took the best copy, a clean, crisp printout of the signature page, with my own familiar signature and that of the developer, and I placed it in a new file folder. On the tab, I wrote, in neat block letters, the end. The construction proceeded at a furious pace. All through the summer and into the fall, my quiet mornings were shattered by the roar of generators, the beep, beep, beep of trucks in reverse, and the shouts of workers. They tore up the hillside, grading it into flat terraces. They poured oceans of concrete. The skeletons of 14 condominium units rose against the skyline, blocking my view of the sunrise. They were 2-story structures, packed tightly together, each with a small balcony facing the view they had stolen from me. I documented everything. I set up a time-lapse camera on my roof, taking one picture every 5 minutes, from dawn until dusk. I flew a small, quiet drone over the site once a week, taking high-resolution aerial photos to document their progress. Everything was saved, dated, and archived. I kept a detailed log of every truck, every contractor, every delivery. I was not just a victim. I was the world's most meticulous, unpaid site supervisor. As the buildings took shape, Karina's arrogance grew in proportion. She was on site every day, the queen of her new domain. She would often stand on the edge of the construction site, near my property line, and just stare at my house. It was a look of pure, triumphant spite. She thought she had won. She thought her will had triumphed over my dusty old papers. The breaking point for the authorities, or at least the first official intervention, came in September. The framing was up on most of the units, and they were starting to install the sheathing. I had maintained my routine of posting laminated, no trespassing notices along my true property line every morning. And every morning, a member of the construction crew, presumably on Karenina's orders, would tear them down. One morning I decided to change my tactics. Instead of just posting the notices, I went out at sunrise with my old surveying equipment. I set up a tripod, mounted a theodolite, and began taking sightings. I wasn't actually surveying. The legal survey was already done and certified. I was creating a visual, an undeniable statement. I was a man with professional equipment on his own land, marking his own boundaries. It was a piece of silent theater. It worked better than I could have imagined. Within 30 minutes, Karena's white truck screeched to a halt. This time, she didn't get out. She sat in her truck, fuming, and made a phone call. 15 minutes later, 2 county sheriff's deputies rolled up. This was the moment I had been preparing for. This was Part D. The neutral authority. Karenina got out of her truck to greet them, her voice a carefully modulated performance of a concerned citizen being harassed. "Thank God you're here, officers," she said, loud enough for me to hear from 50 yards away. "This man," she pointed at me, "has been harassing our work crews for months. He keeps trespassing on our construction site, and now he's setting up this stuff, trying to intimidate my workers. He's delusional. He thinks this is his land. We have permits, we have deeds, we are a legitimate construction project, and he is interfering with it." The two deputies, one older and weary-looking, the other young and alert, walked over to me. I remained calm. I didn't raise my voice. I simply turned off my equipment and waited for them to approach. "Sir," the older deputy said, his hand resting near his sidearm, "we've received a complaint that you are trespassing and interfering with a construction project." "Good morning, officer," I said calmly. "My name is Arthur Vance, and this is my property." I reached into the pocket of my work vest. The younger deputy tensed slightly. I moved slowly. I pulled out a plastic sleeve containing 3 documents. "This is my driver's license," I said, handing it to him. "This is a copy of my recorded deed for this parcel of land. And this," I said, handing him the 3rd document, "is a copy of a certified boundary survey, completed and recorded with the county surveyor's office 2 months ago, showing the precise location of my property line, which you are both currently standing about 30 feet inside of." The younger deputy took the documents. The older one watched me, his eyes assessing. Karenina had started to walk over, ready to inject herself into the conversation. But the older deputy held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Ma'am, please wait by your vehicle." Her face was a mask of fury, but she complied. The younger deputy read the documents. His eyebrows went up. He was trained to read official forms, to look for seals and signatures. My documents were pristine, official, and clear. He handed them to his partner. The older deputy glanced at them, then back at me. "So your claim, Mr. Vance," he said, his tone shifting from confrontational to procedural, "is that this entire construction site is on your property." "That is not my claim, officer," I corrected him gently. "That is a legally established fact, documented by the county. My claim is that Miss Bishop and her contractors are engaged in criminal trespass, felony, vandalism, and the illegal conversion of real property. I have repeatedly notified them in writing to cease and desist, and they have ignored those notices. In fact, Miss Bishop has made a habit of personally destroying the notices." The deputy looked over at Karenina, who was vibrating with impatience. He looked at the half-built condos. He looked back at me. "This looks like a civil matter, sir." "It is a civil matter," I agreed. "But it is also a criminal one. They are actively damaging my property at this very moment. However, I am not asking you to arrest anyone. I am not asking you to shut them down. I am a patient man." I paused, letting that sink in. "What I am asking is that you make a formal police report. I want it noted on the record that on this date, at this time, I, Arthur Vance, owner of record for this parcel, informed the sheriff's department that a trespass was in progress. I want it noted that I presented you with my deed and my certified survey. And I want it noted," I said, looking directly at the younger officer, who I noticed had a body camera on his vest, "that the president of the Evergreen Estates HOA, Karenina Bishop, is the party directing these illegal activities. I would like to make a formal statement to that effect for your report." I saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a hint of admiration, in the older deputy's eyes. He had seen this movie before, but he had never seen it with a protagonist who had brought his own script. I was not asking them to solve my problem. I was using them to create another piece of irrefutable evidence. The police report, And the body camera footage that would be associated with it would become Exhibit D in my case file. It would prove that the authorities had been notified, that my claim was clear and documented, and that Karenina had been put on notice, yet again this time by law enforcement. "All right, Mr. Vance," the deputy said with a sigh. "Let's take your statement." For the next 20 minutes, I calmly and methodically laid out the facts as the younger deputy took notes. I did not speculate. I did not get emotional. I just stated the timeline, the documents, the actions. While I was talking, Karenina was screaming at the older deputy, her voice a shrill symphony of indignation. I could hear snippets of it. "It's our land. He's a crazy old man. Look at our permits." When I was finished, the deputy read his notes back to me. They were accurate. "Will you be pressing charges today, sir?" he asked. "Not today," I said. "I believe in letting people have enough rope to hang themselves. I just want this documented, thoroughly." The deputies finally left. They gave Karenina a warning for creating a public disturbance and told her this was a civil matter to be handled in court. They handed me a card with a report number on it. I tucked it into my pocket. It was as valuable as a gold coin. Karenina stood there, fuming, as the patrol car drove away. She had called the authorities to vanquish her enemy, and they had ended up taking his statement and giving her a lecture. The mask had slipped. For the first time I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was confusion. Her world, for a brief moment, had not bent to her will. She glared at me, then at my surveying equipment, then back at me. She had no idea that the official report number in my pocket was infinitely more powerful than the bulldozers on her stolen hill. She got in her truck and spun her tires in the gravel as she left. It was a childish, impotent display. And I knew, with the certainty of a surveyor finding a hidden monument, that the community was about to begin to turn. The encounter with the sheriff's deputies was a turning point, not just for me, but for the silent, watchful community of Evergreen Estates. The story of the confrontation spread, likely embellished by Karenina herself, in an attempt to frame me as a lunatic. But the details that leaked out, that I had produced a deed, that I had remained calm, that the deputies had spent 20 minutes taking my statement, began to sow seeds of doubt. People who had been cowed into silence started to wonder. A few days later, I was in my garden, pulling weeds. When I saw Mr. Henderson walking slowly up my driveway, he was a small, frail man in his 80s. And the walk from his house 2 streets over was an effort. He carried a small, insulated lunch bag. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if he were a spy engaged in a clandestine exchange. "Arthur," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "can I talk to you for a moment?" I invited him inside, made him a cup of tea, and we sat at my kitchen table. He was the fearful Allie, the conscience of the community, finally moved to action. He told me he'd heard what happened with the sheriff. He said people were talking, some still supported Karenina, but others were getting nervous about the potential legal exposure. "She's gone too far this time, Arthur," he said, wringing his hands. "We all knew she was a bully, but this is grand larceny. She told the board that you had agreed to sell the land, that it was all a done deal. She showed them a document, a letter of intent. She said the legal challenges were just a formality." My mind raced. A letter of intent, a forgery. Another felony to add to the list. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "your information could be very helpful. But I would never ask you to put yourself at risk." He seemed to gather his courage. He reached into his lunch bag and pulled out, not a sandwich, but a small digital audio recorder and a thumb drive. "I've been on the Architectural Review Committee for 5 years, he said, a faint blush of shame on his cheeks. "I mostly just voted with her to avoid trouble. But after what she did to me with that mailbox flagga, I started recording the closed session meetings. The ones where she tells us what we're going to vote on before the public meeting even starts. He pushed the thumb drive across the table. It's all on here, the last year of meetings. The first time she proposed the Hillside villa project. The part where she told the board you were a senile old man, and that the land would be theirs one way or another. The meeting where she announced the forged letter of intent. She told everyone it was a strategic document, and that you were too confused to remember signing it. It was a treasure trove of evidence. It was the voice of the conspiracy, recorded and preserved. I looked at this small, brave man who had endured years of humiliation and had finally decided to fight back. "I don't know how to thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Just get her, Arthur," he said, his eyes wet. "Don't let her get away with it." Not this time. The next piece of the coalition fell into place a week later. I received an anonymous envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a plain thumb drive and a single sticky note with the words, "Check the loan documents. A friend on the board." This had to be the disillusioned insider. I plugged the drive into a secure, air-gapped laptop. It contained a complete set of the HOA's financial records for the past 2 years, including the loan application for the condo project. The documents were staggering. Karenina had secured a $15 million construction loan from a regional bank using the HOA's existing assets and the projected value of the new condos as collateral. But to do that, she had submitted a fraudulent prospectus. The loan documents included a copy of my property deed, but with a forged addendum attached, granting the HOA development rights. The notary's stamp on the forgery was from a notary public who, a quick search revealed, had had his commission revoked 2 years prior for fraud. She had also included a falsified environmental report that listed my wooded hillside as barren scrubland, and a fraudulent appraisal that valued the land at 10 times its actual worth, based on the assumption that it was already zoned for high-density housing. She hadn't just built her castle on my land, she had built it on a foundation of pure unadulterated bank fraud. The HOA was on the hook for millions, and the individual board members who had signed off on the loan were personally liable. The friend on the board, I suspected it was a woman named Cynthia, a quiet accountant who always looked uncomfortable in meeting, had just handed me the financial guillotine. With this new evidence, Ben Carter and I finalized our strategy. We had the quiet title judgment, which was now just weeks away from being finalized by the judge. We had Karenina's video-recorded confession. We had the audio recordings of the board meetings from Mr. Henderson. We had the fraudulent loan documents from our friend on the board. We had the police report. We had a mountain of evidence so high and so solid that it was its own geological feature. Just as we were preparing to file our final motions, Karenina made her last, desperate, and utterly predictable move. She escalated. She had her lawyer, the same one who had ignored our quiet title suit, file for a temporary restraining order against me. The filing was a masterpiece of fiction. It claimed I was a threat to public safety, that I had threatened workers with my surveying equipment, which they called a strange weapon-like device, and that my presence near the construction site was causing emotional distress to MS. Bishop. The judge, seeing only one side of the story on a Friday afternoon, granted the TRO. A deputy served me the papers that evening. However, I was forbidden from coming within 500 feet of the construction site, the construction site on my own land. I was forbidden from contacting Karenina, Bishop, or any member of the HOA board. I was forbidden from interfering with the project. In any way. Ben called me in a panic. "Arthur, this is a problem. We have to fight this." I was strangely calm. I was reading the TRO, and I had to admire its audacity. "No, Ben," I said. "We don't fight it, We obey it to the letter. I will not go near the property. I will not contact anyone. I will let them have their final brief, uncontested victory. But why? He asked, exasperated. Because, Ben, I explained patiently. This TRO is the most beautiful gift she could have possibly given us. It is a legal document, signed by a judge, that officially memorializes her entire fraudulent claim. She has now committed perjury in a sworn declaration to the court. She has taken her private fantasy and made it a public record. This isn't a setback. This is the cherry on top of our evidentiary sundae. We'll let the TRO stand. In fact, we'll even ask for an extension. The next 2 months were quiet. The construction was completed. A grand opening was held. A local news station did a fawning segment on the visionary HOA president who had brought luxury hillside living to the community. All 14 units, which had been pre-sold based on plans and a slick marketing brochure, were closed on. New families started moving in. They planted flowers in the new landscaping. They put welcome mats in front of their new front doors. They had no idea. None of them. Finally, the day came. Ben called me. We have it, he said. The final, signed, and recorded judgment in the matter of Vance the World. The court has affirmed your title is clear and absolute. No, Ben, I said, looking out my window at the lights twinkling in the windows of the 14 condos on my hill. It's not over. It's just beginning. The setting for the final confrontation was perfect. It was a special welcome to the community meeting for the new residents of the Hillside Villas, hosted by Karenina Bishop herself. It was held in the brand new community clubhouse, a handsome building with a river rock fireplace and expansive plate glass windows, a building that sat like a jewel in a stolen crown, squarely in the middle of my property. The room was packed. On one side were the 14 new families, excited and happy, sipping cheap champagne from plastic flutes. On the other side were Karenina and her loyal HOA board members, preening and glowing in the warmth of their apparent success. A few other residents from the main part of Evergreen Estates were there as well, including Mr. All Henderson, who sat near the back looking small but resolute. I had asked him to be my witness. My lawyer, Ben Carter, and I were not invited, of course. The temporary restraining order was still technically in effect, a fact that gave Karenina an extra layer of smug security. She believed she had legally banished me from my own life. We waited until she was at the peak of her performance. We had a spotter inside of Cynthia, the disillusioned board member, who was texting us updates. Karenina had just taken the podium to thunderous applause. She launched into a long, emotional, and entirely self-congratulatory speech. She talked about her vision, her struggle, and her unwavering commitment to the community. She painted a picture of herself as a warrior who had battled selfish interests and obstructionists to create this beautiful new enclave. She even shed a few tears, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, a piece of stagecraft she had clearly rehearsed. She's wrapping up, Cynthia's text read. Tears have been deployed. It's time, I said to Ben. We were parked a quarter-mile down the road. We had with us 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies, not the same ones from before, but men who had been thoroughly briefed by their captain. We were not there to violate the TRO. We were there to serve legal documents, a legally protected activity. The deputies were there simply to keep the peace. We walked into the clubhouse at the precise moment Karenina was saying, "And so I welcome you all, not just as residents, but as owners. Welcome to your new home." The room erupted in applause. It was at this exact moment of peak triumph that the doors swung open. Ben and I walked in, flanked by the 2 deputies. The applause died instantly. A wave of confused silence washed over the room. Every eye was on us. Karenia's face was a study in collapsing realities. Her triumphant smile froze, then curdled into a snarl of disbelief and rage. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He can't be here. He's violating a restraining order. Officers, arrest this man." One of the deputies stepped forward. "Ma'am, Mr. Vance is here with his legal counsel for the express and limited purpose of serving legal notices." "Man, he is not in violation of the order. Please calm down." Ben walked to the front of the room and stood beside the podium. He carried a single, slender file folder. He didn't look at Karenina. He addressed the room, his voice calm and professional. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Carter. I am the attorney for Mr. Arthur Vance, the gentleman standing by the door. I apologize for the interruption, but there is an urgent legal matter that concerns everyone in this room, particularly the new residents of the Hillside villas." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The new homeowners were looking at each other, their happy smiles replaced by frowns of concern. "I have here," Ben said, opening the folder, "a few documents I'd like to share. I won't bore you with all of them, just the highlights." Karenina tried to shout him down. "This is a private meeting. You have no right, get out." But the presence of the deputies had cowed her. Her supporters looked uncertain. "First," Ben said, holding up a document, "this is a certified copy of the original deed for the 30-acre parcel of land known as County Parcel 7B4. It was purchased in 1978 by Arthur and Eleanor Vance. It has been his sole and private property ever since. Let's call this Exhibit A." He placed it on the podium. "Second," he continued, holding up another paper, "this is a certified boundary survey, recorded with the county, which clearly shows that this clubhouse, and all 14 of the condominium units you believe you have just purchased, are located entirely within the boundaries of Mr. Vance's private property." He paused. "Exhibit B." A murmur went through the crowd. The new homeowners were starting to look pale. One man in the front row, who had been beaming just moments before, looked like he was going to be sick. "Now, I know what you've been told," Ben said, his voice full of sympathy. "You've been told this land belonged to the HOA. You were shown documents, perhaps. Which brings me to Exhibit C." He held up a copy of the fraudulent notary document. "This is the deed addendum that was filed with the construction loan documents. It purports to grant development rights to the HOA. We have a sworn affidavit from the Secretary of State's office that the notary, who supposedly stamped this document, had his commission revoked for fraud 2 years prior to the date on the document. This document is a forgery. And filing a forged document in a real property transaction is a felony." Karenina made a small, choking sound. The color was draining from her face. The mask was not just slipping, it was shattering. "There's more," Ben said, his tone relentless. "We have audio recordings of HOA board meetings where the plan to take Mr. Vance's land was discussed. We have copies of the fraudulent loan application submitted to the bank. We have a police report documenting the ongoing trespass. But I know you're all busy people, so I'll skip to the end." He pulled the final document from the folder. It was heavy, bound with a blue legal cover. "This," he said, his voice dropping slightly for dramatic effect, "is the most important document of all. This is a final judgment from the County Superior Court. It's from a lawsuit called a quiet title action. The defendant in this case was not just the Evergreen Estates HOA, but the entire world. The court has ruled, after reviewing all the evidence, that Arthur Vance's title to this land is clear, absolute, and unassailable. This judgment was recorded with the county recorder's office last Tuesday. It is now the final, legal, and unbreakable truth." He let the silence hang in the air for a long, painful moment. "What this means," he said finally, turning to look directly at the 14 families. is that the deeds you hold for your new homes are unfortunately worthless. They are based on a fraudulent conveyance from an entity, the HOA, that never owned the land it purported to sell you. Legally, you are not homeowners, you are trespassers. This building, your homes, the very ground beneath your feet, belongs to Mr. Arthur Vance. That was the moment, the collapse. Karenina Bishop, who had been standing rigid, her knuckles white on the edge of the podium, seemed to deflate. The performative confidence, the carefully constructed persona of the benevolent tyrant, evaporated in an instant. Her face went blank, her eyes wide with the sudden, catastrophic understanding of her miscalculation. She looked at me standing by the door, and for the first time, I think she actually saw me. Not as a doddering old man, but as the architect of her ruin. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her entire world, built on a foundation of lies, had just been demolished by a stack of paper. The professional process server then stepped forward and, one by one, served Karenina and each of the board members with a summons for a massive civil lawsuit covering damages, fraud, and legal fees. He then served every one of the new homeowners with a notice of eviction. It was brutal, it was procedural, and it was just. The aftermath was a slow-motion explosion of legal and financial consequences. The celebratory meeting turned into a scene of chaos and despair. The new homeowners, realizing they had been sold a lie, turned on Karenina with a fury that was terrifying to behold. The dream she had sold them had become a nightmare, and they knew exactly who to blame. The deputies had to escort her from the building for her own safety. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of the disaster became clear. The bank that had issued the $15 million loan immediately froze the HOA's accounts and filed its own lawsuit, citing the fraudulent loan application. The HOA's insurance carrier, upon learning of the board's willful conspiracy and fraud, denied all coverage, leaving the board members personally liable for the mountain of debt and damages. They were facing financial ruin. Karenina Bishop was, of course, the primary target. She was recalled as HOA president in an emergency meeting that was more like a public shaming. She was sued by the bank, by the HOA's new leadership, and by every single one of the 14 families who had bought the phantom condos. The district attorney's office, prompted by the evidence we provided, opened a criminal investigation into bank fraud, forgery, and perjury. Her Husbanus construction company, tainted by the scandal, went bankrupt within 6 months. They lost their house. The last I heard, she was working as a cashier in a discount store in another state. A quiet, anonymous life being the last thing she ever wanted. The community began the slow, painful process of healing. A new HOA board was elected, led by a chastened and humbled Cynthia, the disillusioned insider who had provided the financial documents. Their first official act was to formally apologize to me, and to rescind every fine Karenina had ever levied against Mr. Henderson and others. They refunded his money for the mailbox flag. It was a small gesture, but a powerful one. The most immediate problem, of course, was the 14 families living in beautiful, brand-new condos that now legally belonged to me. The eviction notices were a legal necessity to establish my rights. But I had no intention of actually throwing 14 families out on the street. That wasn't justice, that was cruelty. That would have made me no better than her. I had Ben Carter arrange a meeting, not in the stolen clubhouse, but at a neutral community hall. I attended, along with Ben. The 14 families were there, along with the new HOA board. They were scared, angry, and defeated. They expected me to be a monster. I stood up and told them my story. I told them about Eleanor, about the oak tree, about what the land meant to me. And then I offered them a solution. I had no desire to be a landlord, and I had no desire to live next to a ghost town of empty buildings. I offered to sell the land to the bankrupt HOA, but to a new cooperative formed by the 14 homeowners themselves. I would sell them the land their homes stood on, plus a small surrounding parcel for common areas, for a fair price. The price was not the inflated fraudulent value Karenina had used, but the simple fair market value of the raw land as determined by an independent appraiser we would all agree on. The total price was just under $1 million, a fraction of what they had already lost. It was a bitter pill for them to swallow, having to buy the land they thought they already owned, but it was a path forward. It gave them a chance to actually own their homes. They pooled their resources, secured new financing based on real assets, and they bought the land from me. The money from the sale was more than I ever needed. I paid my legal fees to Ben. I paid the capital gains tax. And the rest? I used it to establish a charitable trust in Eleanor's name, the Eleanor Vance Foundation for the Preservation of Natural Spaces. Its first act was to purchase a conservation easement on the remaining 28 acres of my land, ensuring that it could never be developed, ever. The hillside, her hillside, was now protected forever. I also made a quiet, anonymous donation to a legal aid fund for people fighting unscrupulous HOAs. It seemed fitting. Life is quiet again on my hill. The Evergreen Estates, HOA, is a quieter, more reasonable place. The new homeowners in the hillside villas, now legally and properly constituted, are good neighbors. We wave. We respect the new, clearly marked boundary fence that I paid for and installed myself. Sometimes I see them walking on the public trail that now runs along the edge of the conservation land, and they nod to me with a kind of weary respect. We are all survivors of Karenina Bishop's war. I still sit on my porch every morning with my coffee. The view is different now. I can't ignore the 14 condos that block the lowest part of the sunrise. They are a permanent monument to one woman's arrogance and greed. But they are also a monument to something else. The quiet, unyielding power of the truth when it is meticulously documented. In my office, the banker's box full of evidence is gone, shipped off to the archives of various law firms, but one thing remains. On the mantelpiece next to a picture of Eleanor is a simple, black frame. It doesn't contain a photo or a painting. It contains a single sheet of paper, the final, signed judgment for my quiet title action. It is just a piece of paper, covered in dense, legal text. But to me, it is a work of art. It is a poem. It is the last word in a long, exhausting argument. It is the deed, in every sense of the word. And it is my piece.